If our constant exposure to screens over the last 125 years has had a deep impact on our optic subconscious, then one of those suboptic influences must surely be on our relation to surface, space, form and image. The birth of the cinema in 1895 and the X-ray a few days before symbolically ushered in a slow but steady transition from the solid to the ephemeral. The primary condition of the wall, once the solid spatial boundary of architecture in the city, through the influence of media and particularly the screen, has slowly dissolved into a state of what could be termed as screenness. The effects are twofold. First, architects were influenced by the screen and the screen apparatus to produce the new screen-like architectural surfaces. Secondly, our constant exposure to screens in all their manifestations and mutations has likely changed our spatial and surface conditioning, so we experience surface, space, form and the city in different ways. What are the characteristics of the screen and our relation to screens that can help explain our current spatial surface relations in the contemporary city? False movement and cinematic spatial depth on a paper-thin screen. The wall as a defined boundary has for a long time been mutating towards a state of screenness. Until recently, the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 would have appeared to be the last symbolic gasp of the dying concept of the wall as a solid boundary. Although this concept persists, its conditions have changed. For most of the 20th century, the wall has been slowly mutating towards new conditions in which the once solid wall becomes permeable or semi-transparent and more screen-like, or even a zone of surveillance. This is a transformation that is parallel to the growing proliferation and influence of the screen within our everyday environment. Both the wall and screen share certain qualities and effects. To understand the contemporary surface wall, we must also understand the screen in all its manifestations. The screen is like a black hole in our living room. It brings faraway space and alternate time zones into close proximity, causing a perceptual space-time disjuncture into our living room via the flat-screen television on the wall. The camera has replaced the wall. Besides the materiality of the wall transforming, its function has also been affected by and sometimes taken over by the camera. Because of this, the wall as a signifier has mutated in various ways, to sometimes include the conventional solid image, the modern X-ray style screen, and the prison wall with cameras. Not only has the wall changed, but the way we experience and relate to surface has most likely altered through living in a society surrounded by screens of all sizes. There is quite possibly a link between our spatial relations to the screen and the illusion of space, depth and time within the screen, and an effect on our experience of surface. The birth of the cinema in 1895 was the beginning of a slow but steady mutation of the conditions of the wall as boundary and our relation to architectural surface, the beginning of a type of screenness. The Lumiere's 1896 film, Demolition of a Wall, a reverse motion film of a wall falling down, according to Walter Benjamin, exposed an actual optic subconscious for the first time. This image of a wall reverse collapsing is prophetic of the mutations that architectural surface would undergo over the next century. Before the cinema, experiments with the cathode ray dated from around 1875, and the first official X-ray took place in December 1895, just 6 days before the first film screening. We could say that before 1895 was the age of the material, whereas 1895 ushered in the age of the immaterial. Mies van der Rohe collected X-rays. He experimented with the X-ray nature of reflections and structure in the Friedrichstrasse skyscraper project and the 1922 glass skyscraper project. These were early studies of screenness and the potential of a new X-ray-like semi-transparency in architecture. We can see an early move towards inflecting the wall with the cinematic and the use of the white wall by Adolphe Loos and Le Corbusier. The room plan of Loos and then the free plan of Le Corbusier work as diagrams of cinematic spatial disjuncture, very similar to the screen. Both concepts embody the space-time shifts that are integral elements of the screen between interior and exterior, as well as from space to space. Diagrammatically, we can see the white cube exterior of their 1920s houses as being like a three-dimensional empty white cinema screen, with dissociative relations to a chaotic or picturesque interior, like the multi-spaces of the projected film. This is the pre-television experience of the cinema screen as white surface with other spaces and temporalities inside it when projected upon. In Year Zero Faciality, Deleuze and Guattari describe the white wall of signification and the black hole of consciousness and subjectivity. The model for this is the face, which deterritorializes over the landscape. The orifices, eyes, mouth, becoming black holes of consciousness. We can apply this concept of faciality to architectural surface, white walls and shadowed windows. Now the perforated wall often gradates the white wall of signification and the shadowed black holes into an abstract void like the blur of the television on the blink. The free facade envisaged by Le Corbusier in his 5 Points of New Architecture in 1926 has now slipped out of the confines of traditional masonry construction and the slab and column diagram of the Maison Domino. The wall has mutated as its various functions have separated in space and become distinct layers of function. Inside boundary, outside barrier. Internal and external abstract shape. Semi-solid wall and transparent window. Sunshade signifying skins. To understand the mutation of the building skin, we need to take into account the history of the cavity wall, the role of poché, the screen and the veil in traditional architecture. These all play their part in the transformations that have happened to the building skin up until now, and in the development of walls and the current tendency towards a kind of screenness. The optical metal facade, which we first saw in Herzog and de Meuron's signal box, helps to dissolve the separateness of the wall's functions. The wall begins to separate out as it is no longer the one single defined boundary as indicated by a thick black line on a plan. In buildings following on from this, the cavity wall slowly expanded to become many layers, the gap between wall and outer skin expanding and contracting at will, embracing the screen as layer and brise-soleil, and surface expanding and absorbing the space. Relations such as that between window and wall began dissolving to become the one slightly out of focus experience, as windows began to frequently hide behind abstract pattern skins. In the metal half-tone screen wall, the solid and transparent have become a gradient, favouring the in-between as the prevalent experience, creating a new sense of screen space. In this expanded cavity wall, we get a blurring of opacity levels from both inside and outside. Now buildings can be abstract screens influenced by the static of the television caught between channels, like the signal box, or have images on them like Ome's Karlsruhe project and Herzog de Meuron's Eberswald library. Or buildings can be shaped as images situated in a screenscape city like Gary's Bilbao or Ome's CCTV. The building with image or abstract pattern is like a television screen, whereas the building shaped like an image conceives of the world or tabula rasa as a screenscape, upon which the buildings float or is projected as an image object. The wall in our contemporary city has often evolved into the screen-like state of the credit sequence, hovering between abstraction and sign. For many years in the 20th century, the static of the TV screen late at night was one of the most common experiences of the void. The void permeates the appearance of the television screen tuned to a dead channel in movies such as Godard's Numéro 2, Prénom Carmen and Tobe Hooper's Poltergeist, where we contemplate static. With the recent popularity of the perforated metal skin, we have the whole facade in many instances taking on the static of channel surfing, like the TV sky in William Gibson's Neuromancer. Even if we ignore the obvious use of media walls in the urban environment, the overriding new status of the skin is that of an information surface, even when there's no actual image, just optical abstraction or a void. The camera has now replaced the wall. The ancient function of a wall as a boundary has evolved and has often been taken over by the camera. The boundary wall, one of the most primitive architectural and political acts, has been replaced by often overlapping surveillance zones. This is Vouillier's position in The Overexposed City, in which he describes the camera surveillance boundary of the modern city and the space-time disjuncture of the screen as the new city boundary. The contemporary smart border wall, like those being developed by Israeli defense company Albert, make the line in the sand a blurred surveillance zone which surrounds the actual wall in closed-circuit television zones and can potentially eradicate the actual physical boundary wall in places where it might not be possible to build one. Virilio wrote that closed-circuit television surveillance has served the function of walls in American suburbs with the toll booth surveillance cameras, and that these have replaced the function of the old city wall. With the camera and the screen taking over much of the boundary function of the traditional wall, there is a dispersion over space and time in the notion of the boundary. This screen interface has not only affected us deeply in the experience of everyday space, but has also affected the way we now design these spaces. Spatial disjunctures are now more likely to occur than spatial flow. In places where previously spatial disjuncture used to happen, like the classical boundary wall, we now tend to have the flow of the screen, but a new type of flow which incorporates shifts, a non-chronological flow, and the overlapping zones of multiple surveillance cameras. In the cinema, the all-seeing camera often travels through walls, sometimes floors, exposing scene after scene as in Kubrick's The Killing. We see the sectional doll's house set in A Night of the Hunter and Tout Va Bien. In architecture, the section building cuts away walls or renders them invisible or opaque to produce camera-like views through a cut in the building, just like a screen. The section facade exposes new spatial types to the outside, as in OMA Très Grande Bibliothèque project, the Jussieu Library, and the Educatorium in Utrecht. The conceptual and actual replacing of the wall by the camera has resulted in these section facades, the X-ray skin, the screen in the TV building, as well as the function of surveillance and separation being partly overtaken by cameras. Surface appears to absorb space in the television screen and its various offspring, like an ever-changing perceptual sponge surface. Here surface is sometimes paper-thin, sometimes a few centimetres thick, but has within it multitudes of conflicting spatialities. This is obviously an explicit screen experience that could be channeled to motivate design disjunctures and distortions in architectural space and objects. Cronenberg's Videodrome plays with the horror of our psychological sense of screen depth. The images of the television screen in Videodrome show comically how the impression of screen depth works perceptually in surface. Throughout the 20th century, there has been a tendency for building skins to mutate towards a screen-like surface, and this film could help us understand this situation. In a world in which the panopticon has been replaced by the screens of social media, it would seem worthwhile to analyse the structure of the viewer-screen relationship to see if it sheds light on modern surface. An analysis of the screen could shed light on the ideological spatial implications of the contemporary wall surface. In 1970, Jean-Louis Baudry analysed cinematic apparatus, utilising Marxist ideology, Lacan's theory of the mirror stage, and Plato's story of the cave. The false movement of still images in the cinema and TV, falsely appearing to move, according to Baudry, paralleled the masking of true political and social relations within our society. Lacan's mirror stage was used to explain our psychoanalytic relation to the screen. Plato's cave was used as a diagram of the viewer film experience with its masking of reality. Our situation in relation to the screen has changed much in the 50 years since Baudry wrote his article, but has become an interesting starting point. The sign of the wall's boundary is also mutated. The solid wall persists as an image, but generally the image is split between the surveillance camera and an image of the prison or detention center security wall. Trump's US-Mexico border wall is an image, a sign of a wall for mass media propaganda. The paradox of constructing a physical boundary in a digital, screen-driven society is that the wall is primarily intended as an image for our screens. Here the wall is a media sign to be viewed on a smartphone news update. The border wall is more effective as an image on a screen, as propaganda, than it is actually keeping people separated. Architectural surfaces generally evolved to include various chaotic screen-like perforations, overlaps, fades, and reflections, opening up a sense of screenness in our everyday experience of surface, the boundary, form, and space. This is complemented by the camera replacing part of the wall's function. The wall's boundary has mutated into surveillance zones. The traditional solid wall remains as various signs and images of the wall in the media. The research for these ideas often came out of the design process in our office in Avenue Reed, where we would intuitively work ideas from the films into the buildings. So the PEP building, also known as the Precinct Energy Project, was designed in 2011 and is a cogeneration building supplying energy to central Dandenong, a satellite city near Melbourne. PEP is an abstract object with a screen-like surface wrapped around it. It is placed in the central plaza like a piece of space junk or a space object that no one enters. We just look at it and move around it, being too dangerous to actually go inside with the power. The perforated metal skin surface has a gradation of hole sizes which form a splatter image on the main facade, and behind it is a cogeneration diagram on the laneway facade explaining how the building works. Like the television on the blink, flickering between static and image, there is an alternation between abstract imagery, like the building form and the splatter image, and recognisable signs such as the big power points and the big switch. The building sits in the plaza like a big television set. At night the screen is backlit and the local teenagers hang around it like an exterior lounge room. Maybe the screen has replaced the fireplace as a focal point of energy and psychological warmth in the contemporary city. So, the Aero Studio is a small gallery in the Australian countryside. It is cited randomly as an image in the screenscape, like a piece of mirrored space junk. The image is used here to counter the dominant Australian architectural image of the slick modernist galvanised colonial shed, which has become synonymous with Australian modern architecture. In this house in Richmond in Melbourne, we were interested in experimenting with the notion of the house as a screen for living in. The site is a small 6 by 20 metre inner city plot subject to multiple town planning restrictions, and the design process was a series of manoeuvres to maximise the illusion and creation of space. The extruded cube is sliced with voids which allow light and views into the spaces. The triangular void to the living area is also the preferred entry to the side street and separated by a large perforated metal screen. The screen acts like a screen barrier between inside and outside. The outside elevation is like a gradated blur or colour swatch from black to white with a dot screen in the centre. Like entering the screen space in Videodrome, one enters the screen through a slice of narrow triangular space into the house. So from inside, one looks at the street through a dot screen, enjoying complete privacy in the daytime. At night, the interior lights up like a television. The house celebrates a kind of cathode ray dot screen spatiality and surface. The interior space is a homage to the television on the blink. A static visual field is a boundary to the living space, separating inside from outside and also filtering views. The outside becomes a cinemascope scenario. From private interior at daytime, in which we are a viewer, to transforming into the interior of a screen at night, there's a shift from subject to object. The screen can make the street or the house the TV, depending on the time of day and the lighting conditions. The space of the TV on the blink. A poem to the static blur. How to live inside a television set. Thank you.